afternoon, good evening, good morning. A special good evening to those of you who are tuning in late tonight from Europe. Thank you for staying up. Wherever and whenever you're joining us from, we hope you're well and are glad to see you here. My name is Johanna Ransmeyer. I'm a historian of China and China's legal history based at the University of Chicago. And I would like to welcome you to the final panel in this spring quarter series of public panels on human rights in China. This series is sponsored by the Posen Family Center for Human Rights, the History Department, and the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Chicago. Today, we have a wonderful team of experts joining us to discuss the Olympic Games and human rights in China. The Olympics offer a special opportunity in which to think about the current situation of human rights in the PRC, and in many ways hold up a mirror to the world in which to see where the international community stands with regard to the ongoing crises there. To what extent is this more than a chance to reflect? What possibilities are there for action, for leverage, or at the very least for uncovering or exposing, publicizing, not only more about what is happening in China, but also where different entities stand and what can be done? It also bears noting that for many in the human rights community, this feels like a redux of the Beijing summer 2008 Olympics, where promises were made about potential improvements to the human rights situation as various violations continued, even in the name of making way for the event. And yet there are also concrete ways in which this time around things are tangibly different as well. I want to give maximum time to our panelists, but I will briefly introduce each one before they speak. Before I introduce our first panelist, however, let me remind you that you can post questions in the Q&A. Please feel free to remain anonymous or identify yourself and your affiliation if you wish, if you want to share where you're dialing in from. The panelists will be able to see the questions as they come in, but the questions will not be visible to the audience. Our first panelist is Sophie Richardson. She's the China director at Human Rights Watch, where she has overseen Human Rights Watch's work on China since 2006. She earned her doctorate at the University of Virginia and is a graduate of the Hopkins Nanjing program and of Oberlin College. She's the author of a truly wide array of articles and reports ranging over everything from domestic Chinese political reform, democratization, human rights in Cambodia, China, Indonesia, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Vietnam. In fact, if you look at Sophie's profile of work, you get a sense of the global reach of China already. She'll be most familiar to students who are enrolled in the University of Chicago's Human Rights course, as we just read her work on the intervention that China does at the level of the UN and the Human Rights Commission. And she's testified before the European Parliament and the US Senate and has weighed in a large number of forums. So we're very lucky to have her with us to talk with us about human rights in the China Olympics today. Sophie.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you, Professor Ransmeyer, and with Professor Tang Liao, whose case actually we worked on, and in some ways exemplifies the deterioration of rights in China since the 2008 Games. My task today, I gather, is to sort of set the stage for you, particularly in respect to what's changed since 2008. It might bear mention that Human Rights Watch actually for years throughout the aughts and 2000s objected on human rights grounds to China being awarded the Games. Obviously, it hosted the 2008 Games. We objected again when it bid in 2015 for the 2022 Games. And sadly, the IOC did not take our views into account. It is Human Rights Watch's view that the human rights environment inside China has deteriorated significantly since Xi Jinping came to power in 2013 across an incredible range of issues. And what I actually wanted to start with is a story that I think tells you or highlights some of the differences between 2008 and now. And it's the story of an activist named Ji Sizun. And one of the commitments that the Beijing Organizing Committee made to the IOC in order to get the 2008 Games was to allow for some modicum of public protest. So what the Beijing authorities did was set up 3 or 4 designated protest zones around the city in which people could go and purportedly say whatever they wanted, but you had to get a permit to go into those protest zones. So it was already a fairly serious set of restrictions on the freedom of expression. But Jisuzun wanted to take the authorities at their word, and he walked into a Beijing police station in the summer of 2008 in order to get a permit to go into one of these zones. He was detained. He was disappeared for weeks, months. He finally was prosecuted the following year and was over roughly the next 8 or 9 years in and out of prison repeatedly on one of the authorities' favorite charges, picking quarrels and stirring up troubles, which is, of course, utterly meaningless. During those prison stints, he became progressively ill and was not given adequate access to medical treatment. And 2 months after being released from a 4-year sentence in July 2019, Jisuzun died. That is, I think, the story of then versus now in the most important way we can talk about these Olympics and what they mean and the Chinese government's interactions with people who simply want to express their views. Of the 3 or 4 areas I want to highlight where there's been significant change, one must be what Xi Jinping's government has done to independent civil society. Which had over the previous decades made some impressive gains in raising rights awareness, in putting forward an incredible cadre of human rights lawyers, in actually changing some laws and defending people in court. And it was very clear early on in Xi's tenure that this community had to be crushed and silenced. And many of the people who led this movement have over the last decade been detained, disappeared, tortured, and some have indeed died either in detention or just after, including the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo. One of the other sets of controls that I think is much clearer now, or more intense, maybe is the right word, that does relate to the Olympics, pertains to internet censorship. This was another promise that the Chinese government made to the IOC for 2008, that at least for some people around the games, that internet controls would be lessened. And not only was that not the case in 2008, we have seen just an incredible slew of regulations doing everything from criminalizing the use of VPNs, for example, to censorship that probably extends to a degree that we couldn't have even imagined in 2008. There was a very interesting episode recently when the authorities were trying to mobilize criticism of foreign companies over their concerns about using products tainted by forced labor, largely cotton coming from the Xinjiang region. And so briefly, people could actually use the term Xinjiang online. It actually led some people to start asking questions about, what was this sudden interest? What was wrong in Xinjiang? Why was this debate even happening? And it was, a glimpse into the fact that people are curious and want information, but those discussions were fairly quickly shut down. And I think that's going to have material implications for the games. I would also highlight the role of surveillance technology. Some of which was trialed with a view towards producing so-called stability around the 2008 games. And the use of technology has just proliferated extraordinarily. The authorities love it, can't get enough of it. And we've written about everything from the uses and abuses of biometric data to artificial intelligence. There's a new program out by Panorama about emotional recognition software being used on Uyghur detainees. Big data. I think governments are going to have to be very concerned about how surveillance technology is used on people who come to China for the games, but also we have campaigned on companies changing their policies if they are complicit in censoring people inside China. It shouldn't just be about the Olympics. The fourth domestic change I just wanted to point to is the extreme hostility that we've seen towards the foreign media in the last couple of years, up to and including kicking out journalists from certain outlets or from certain nationalities. And the net effect, I think, is to both make it a very hostile environment. In 2008, journalists were going to Beijing in droves, either to cover the Olympics or because it was a big political news story and there was still a certain amount of room to report. Now we're watching the authorities kick foreign journalists out and really constrain the space for them to work. And it's a much less desirable place for journalists to be. And that's not really, I think, good for any of us. Very quickly, because I don't want to go over time, we have documented the Chinese government's efforts to manipulate certain key international institutions, most specifically the UN's human rights ecosystem. And I'm sure Minky will talk more about the Chinese government's relationship with the International Olympic Committee. But the International Olympic Committee has, in part as a result of its experiences with the Chinese government in 2008, put on paper certain human rights commitments and guarantees, but they're of the view that either those don't pertain to the 2022 games because they were signed or adopted after China was awarded these games, or simply because they don't have the guts. The IOC has made very clear, one thing that hasn't changed is the IOC's lack of principles and commitments, and even its rhetoric is very tired and stuck in 2008. And just two other quick points. I think there has been a change, at least in the thinking of some major international companies. And that's equally, I think, about potential problems around boycotts and their sponsorship of the games, consumer activism. There's also the reality of complicity with surveillance technology inside China. And engagement including with some companies that are actually now on US blacklists. There's new reporting out actually about that today, but it's primarily been about the focus that's been brought to bear on companies that operate in the Xinjiang region, where we've estimated about 1 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, other Turkic peoples have been arbitrarily detained simply on the basis of their identity, and there are close links to forced labor. We have serious concerns about the complete inability of companies to do human rights due diligence in the region. And I think companies are really starting to feel some of that pressure, and that creates advocacy opportunities. Last but not least, I think a major change, and this will be a very interesting phenomenon to watch in the coming months, is activism by athletes. People all over the world know who Colin Kaepernick is. Michaela Schifrin, the skier, has already, said very clearly that she's not thrilled to have to choose between competing at all at an Olympics and competing in someplace with a problematic human rights record. And I think this is going to be a real challenge, particularly for the IOC, because we know how the Chinese government will react if anyone wants to show up in 2022 wearing a Uyghur Lives Matter t-shirt. So hopefully that sets the stage for my amazing fellow panelists. I'll stop there and happy to take questions when we get to that portion of the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richardson. And we turn now to Mr. Dolkan Issa, who is president of the World Uyghur Congress, vice president of the Unrepresented National and People's Organizations. He's a former student leader from the pro-democracy demonstrations at Xinjiang University in 1988 and founded the Students' Science and Culture Union at the University in 1987, working on programs to eliminate illiteracy, promote science, and lead other students in East Turkestan. You can see from the kinds of contributions that he's made a lot about the kind of people who struggle to find a place in China with the ongoing genocide against Uyghurs. And so, this is his experience in the late 80s is kind of a foreshadowing. He fled China in 1994, sought asylum in Europe, became a citizen of Germany in 2006. And since that time is presenting Uyghur human rights issues to the UN Rights Council, European Parliament, European governments, and the international human rights organizations community. He's worked to mobilize the diaspora community to collectively advocate for Uyghur rights and the rights of Uyghurs in East Turkestan. And he is in a wonderful position to speak to the importance of this Olympic moment with regard to the ongoing situation for Uyghurs, why the Uyghur perspective on the Olympics proceeding as usual would be damaging, to speak to the situation of Uyghurs both within the PRC and in exile. So with that, I'm delighted to give the floor to Mr. Dolkanisa.
Well, thank you very much. Very wonderful introduction, Joanna. And good night, if I can say, from Germany to everyone. I would like to thank for inviting me to this very important panel to discuss why Winter Olympic Game in Beijing 22 matter so much. For more than 1 year, human rights activists and organizations have been calling International Olympic Committee to move the games, but Olympic Committee has been ignoring or call and the concerns. In the less than a year, Beijing 22 Winter Olympic Game will be open according to the both OIC and the Chinese government. Olympic Games will be open and inclusive and create harmonious world and promote social progress. This could not be further from the truth. For those living under repressive Chinese rule, reality is everything but inclusive, open, and harmonious. Instead, they experience and the brutal crackdown on their fundamental freedoms. When China receives the hosting right for 2008 Summer Olympic Games, it did everything in its power to make sure it was the most successfully one is the history of the Olympics. But in the reality, exploited migrant workers, severely cracked down on dissident, increased censorship, create a propaganda machine around the Olympics, and polluted air and the purpose for the games. It is used this opportunity to stir up nationalist favors and distract the entire world from its authoritarian regime. This time we are in the face of the genocide. Uyghur people as a genocide that the Chinese government itself is orchestrating. In the last, at least alone 4-5 years alone, Chinese government has subjected the Uyghur people to mass arbitrary detention. Over the 3 million innocent Uyghur, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, other Turkic people in the concentration camp. This is the largest such a detention since the Second World War. So, Sophie already saying is more than 1 million. And most of them international NGOs and media continue to repeat it more than 1 million. This is the UN language. 2018 August, UN Committee Limited Racial Discrimination Committee is saying is more than 1 million Uyghur is locked down. This is the UN language. Since then, we have seen, if you look at the ASPI report, Australian Strategic Institute report, and Human Rights report, and Andrea Warden's report, we can see, and since 2018 until 2020, Chinese government continue expanded new builds, so-called eradication capacities concentration camp. But exactly number we don't know, but we estimate up to 3 million people are suffering today. Mass sterilization of Uyghur women and other forced birth prevention measures in order to diminish the Uyghur population. Forced labor, modern slavery, 100,000 of Uyghurs, attempts to destroy unique Uyghur identity and to forcibly assimilate it to the Uyghur people. Destruction, physical representation of the Uyghur identity, including thousands of mosques, graveyards, and other sites of the religious, cultural, historical importance to the Uyghur people. ASPI reports saying between 2017 to 2020, more than 8,000 mosques completely demolished, another 8,000 mosques partly destroyed. And the bans we use the Uyghur language is many school and the public space, several religious persecution, including bans on the growing long beard, wearing Islamic dress, and also collected Quran and the primats Yeah, and also forbidden Islamic name to the Uyghur children, Aisha, Muhammad, Ahmed, Samet. This is also one issue. And separating Uyghur children from the parents who are detained in the camps, and to indoctrinate them to be loyalty Chinese Communist Party and to forsake the Uyghur identity. Chinese government not only harassment the Uyghurs in Turkestan, in the camp or outside the camp, also harassment and punishment Uyghur diaspora and anyone who dare speak out. While I am also one of them, a person who is the victim of this, Chinese government, that's why a lot of Chinese long arm getting around the world and put my name to the Interpol list. I was suffering more than 21 years because of the red notes, but I fight on my right, and finally 2018 my red notes were deleted, but I was detained because of so many country border. Even I kick also from the UN conference. Sophie know very well this, Human Rights Watch, really Sophie trying, and the US embassy, German embassy, and the civil society really work on my case. Then finally I got accreditation again. However, still I have been harassed by the Chinese long arm. This all has been taking place in the last 5 years, for 5 years alone. Everything that unique of us Uyghur people is under attack, or language, culture, religion, history, and ethnic identity. The situation in Tibet has dramatically deteriorated, and the January 2020, for the 5th year in a row, it was listed as the second worst place in the world for the civil and the political right after only Syria. In Hong Kong, Chinese government has implemented a brutal national security law, is beating right of the human right and democratic activists. So the Mongolia Chinese government is trying to ban Mongolian language as a way to erase their cultural identity. Meanwhile, in China, also more journalists, human rights activists are being jailed and exercising this basic right. As you can see, human rights environment significantly worsened since the 2008 summer Beijing Olympic Games, allowing China to host upcoming Winter Games and undermining this core purpose of the Olympic movement. It sent out clear message to the China and to international communities that IOC encourage a repressive regime and the genocidal policy. This will set presented to rest of the world. IOC's mission is to create better world, a world with absolutely no discrimination, no race, religions, genders, sexual orientation. A better world should be a free and democratic world, where there are no camps, no forced labor factories, no cultural religious repression, no arbitrary arrested, no police brutality, world without genocide. It is a better world. On March 28, 2007, Wall Street Journal published an op-ed titled Genocide Olympic, referring to criticize Darfur due to China's unwillingness to vote in favor of resolution as the United Nations Security Council to spend peacekeepers force to Sudan. At that time, many activists, international community condemning China, and the world famous film director Steven Spielberger was pursued to use his influence as a Beijing 28 Games artist consultant for the opening and the closing ceremony of the Games. He wrote a letter to then President of China Hu Jintao, urging China to act and vote and the favor of the resolution to bring an to the genocide in the Darfur. Spielberg threatened quit as an arts consultation to the Olympic. In July of this year, China changed its position in the UN and supports that resolution. If this was made possible to prevent genocide happening outside of China, I don't see why same logistic could not be applied to here to end the Uyghur genocide. As a historical clearly show us, any mega supporting event, particularly Olympic Games, are politically by nature. State use this as a perfect opportunity, flaunt their successes, and seek approval from the international community of their regime, especially these authoritarian ones. China cannot continue to carry out most severe human rights violations and still be given floor to host such a prestigious event. This action cannot be met with immunity. This is why government sponsor national Olympic committees, broadcaster, athletes, and IOC, and a very single individual who believes in human rights and condemns genocide must express their dissatisfaction with the Chinese government and boycott the game if China does not stop the genocide and crime against humanity. As citizens of the world, we have the power to change things. That's why we must all come together in this urgent and the dire times. And I also call on the international community to value human rights over the money and the opportunity. We must defend the core value that are so dear to our democracy and avoid being associated with genocidal Olympics. We can afford lose one of the Olympics, but we cannot afford to lose more human beings at the hand of the Chinese government. Today, global democracy, human rights really has been threatened by the CCP regime. So that's why this kind of panel and this kind of event also very important to stop and change the world and also stop the Beijing genocide Olympic. Really, I believe if the Olympic taking place in Beijing next year, it is not Olympic Games, it is genocidal games. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nisa, for your impassioned call to the international community and for pointing to the enormous hypocrisy and conflict of interest between the IOC's mission statement and its complicity for what's going on in the People's Republic of China. Next, we will turn to Dr. Teng Biao, my co-teacher in the course of Human Rights in China at the University of Chicago. He's, as you know, an academic lawyer and human rights activist, formerly a lecturer at China University of Political Science and Law, and has been a visiting fellow at Harvard, at Yale, at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, NYU, Hunter College, Harvard Center for Human Rights. He has defended cases involving freedom of expression, religious freedom, and the death penalty, Tibetans and Uyghurs. He's an outspoken and tireless advocate. As Dr. Richardson pointed out, his own personal trajectory intersects in compelling ways with the timeline of the past Olympic Games, as the major crackdown on Weiquan human rights lawyers happened in the wake of the hosting of the games. So it was one of the violations that happened after promises had been made in 2008. As regular attendees of this series already know, Professor Teng Biao is currently visiting at the University of Chicago as the Posen Professor at the Posen Family Center for Human Rights. He's been in touch, or tried to be in touch, and then dramatically stonewalled by the International Olympic Committee, and can talk both about his efforts there and efforts to reach out to politicians, to brand ambassadors and world leaders, and in general to speak to the importance of thinking about the Olympics in this moment. So, Professor Teng, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Johanna. So between early 2000 and 2014, I was a scholar and human rights lawyer in China. And 1 year before the Beijing Summer Olympics, in 2007, I wrote an article, co-author with the human rights activist Hu Jia. We documented the human rights violations before the Beijing Summer Olympics. And we call for for the international community to pay more attention to the human rights issues and in China. And then several months before Beijing Olympics, Hu Jia was detained and later sentenced to 3 years and a half. And I was kidnapped by Chinese secret police and detained and tortured before Olympics. I was also disbarred, and my passport was confiscated, and I was banned from teaching. So that's what's happening before and during Beijing Summer Olympics. And there's an anecdote, the Olympic bicycle game that was passing by expressway near my home in Beijing, Badaling Expressway, and then I inserted my ID card to the many ID cards of my family members and relatives to apply for watching the bicycle game, but then all of them were approved and I was denied. When applying to host the Beijing Summer Olympics, Chinese government made a lot of beautiful promise, but of course they never kept its commitment. Two nearly 80-year-old female petitioners in Beijing were sent to labor camps because they applied for a demonstration during Olympics, and at that time Beijing said you can apply for demonstration or assembly in these certain parks, but they never approved any kind of application. What they did is to put those people into labor camps. And then 2015, Beijing was allowed to host the Olympic Games again. And in that year, Chinese government rounded up human rights lawyers and defenders. More than 300 human rights lawyers were either arrested or disappeared, and some of them are still in prison. And also in that year, Chinese government kidnapped a publisher who has Swedish passport in Thailand. So that's really terrifying, kidnapping a foreign citizen on foreign soil. And then we in 2015, I and many human rights defenders all over the world protested against the IOC decision to give Beijing the opportunity to host the 2022 Olympics, but IOC did not respond at all, and they didn't care about the campaigns globally. And then until last October, under the international pressure, IOC agreed to meet a few representatives from more than 180 human rights organizations. And I was one of the human rights activists talking with IOC officials. And they repeatedly said some cliche. One thing is they said Olympic Games could be a very wonderful opportunity to promote human rights and rule of law in Beijing, but that has been proven wrong. The human rights situation and rule of law had been deteriorating before Beijing Summer Olympics and during Beijing Summer Olympics, and because of that, So that's and especially Xi Jinping came to power in 2013. The human rights situation has been worse and worse. And the second thing they said is politics and the sport should be separated. That's seemingly correct, but we are not against sports, and we love sports, but we care more about the people suffering in China, the people like being tortured and brainwashed and raped in the concentration camps in Xinjiang. And Beijing is eager to host the Olympic Games, not because they love sports, but because they can use Olympics as a political tool. And actually, like a 1936 Olympic Games in Nazi Germany, it was used by Hitler to boost its propaganda bonanza. It is IOC that put the global athletes into a difficult position to balance their career and their conscience. And the third thing they said is kind of contradictory to their first point, that IOC is not able to improve human rights. It's only an association of athletes and not a political entity. But my argument is to attend the Beijing Olympics, to give Beijing the opportunity to host Olympics, can be seen as an endorsement to all the atrocities committed by the Chinese Communist Party. So it's a complicity. It was used by Beijing as a clear endorsement, and Beijing can use Winter Olympics to tell the world that China does not have like human rights problems, and they have the endorsement from all the athletes and the IOC from all those countries. So it's a violation of Olympic Charter. So in 2008 some international figure called it a genocide Olympics because Chinese involvement of Darfur genocide. But this time we are seeing ongoing genocide, and the Uyghurs and other Turkic people are suffering in the concentration camps, and also as Dorkin said, Chinese government violated human rights in not only the Uyghur area but also Tibet, Hong Kong, and Mongolia, and all other parts of China. So I think the economic and the diplomatic boycott are not sufficient, and the full boycott can be the most powerful tool to raise the awareness of the ongoing genocide and the government's atrocities. And this tool can be accessed by everyone in the world. And we should not pretend that those who are eager to host the Beijing Olympics next February are not committing genocide and the crimes against humanity. And we should send a clear message to the world that to attend to participate in Beijing Winter Olympics is complicity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tang Biao. Thank you, Tang Biao, for making it so clear that it offers great legitimacy to the PRC's actions domestically to attend the Olympic Games. Our next speaker will speak to that in greater depth. This is Dr. Andrea Warden, an independent human rights researcher, advocate, and translator whose current work focuses on China and the UN human rights system. She's previously served as general counsel for the Congressional Executive Commission on China, as advocacy director for the International Campaign for Tibet, and acting executive director of the health rights nonprofit Asia Catalysts, among other positions involving human rights in Asia. She's written extensively on China and human rights and has taught courses on the PRC legal system. Since 2018, she has been the William S. Reinsch Practitioner Instructor in East Asian Studies at Johns Hopkins Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. She's also the author of a recent article for China Change calling for a firm diplomatic boycott and firmly condemning the sports washing that goes on by hosting the Olympic Games. Andrea.
Thank you so much, Johanna, and thank you, Tang Biao, for the invitation to participate and also for the kind introduction. It's been a wonderful series on China and human rights that you all have put together. I've really enjoyed it and have learned a lot. My remarks, which draw on my recent article that Johanna just mentioned, that I wrote for China Change, will focus on the political importance of the Beijing 2022 Games in terms of the enormous propaganda opportunity they present for the CCP and Xi Jinping to tell China's story well and to amplify Xi's role in that story. But before I turn to my remarks, I wanted to share something that came to my attention today on Twitter, something very encouraging that I was quite surprised to see and glad to see. There is an open letter that is circulating among Chinese students who are studying abroad internationally in the US, in Japan, in the UK, and in other countries. It's a letter to Secretary of State Blinken about the Chinese Communist Party and calling on a boycott of the 2020 Beijing Winter Games. It's eloquent and it's powerful. And I wanted to just read one paragraph. I think it sums up nicely some of the points that Tang Biao just made, and also the points that I'm about to make too. And I may then just sort of skip over some of my points. I think hearing from Chinese students abroad is more important. So this is a quote from the letter. "History and reality have repeatedly taught us that there are only two options before us. Either we allow the Chinese Communist Party to redefine freedom, democracy, and human rights, which are essentially illiberal, non-democratic, and anti-human rights, or the people of the free world unite to defend the hard-won true freedom, democracy, and human rights. Under such circumstances, continuing to support Beijing in hosting the 2022 Winter Olympics would not only serve the dictatorial Chinese communist regime and its acts against humanity, but would also put athletes who dare to express the universal values of freedom and democracy and who are concerned about human rights in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, as well as human rights in China as a whole, in a dangerous situation, and would go against the original purpose of the Olympic movement, to promote human rights, and it would undermine the core values of freedom, democracy, and human rights that the Western world has long adhered to and built upon." So I will stop there. It's a powerful statement from folks who would not be able to make that statement if they were, in China and are already quite substantial, taking a substantial risk to sign on to such a letter. Okay, so I'd like to actually start off by underscoring that it is in my view, that it is a virtual certainty that the Games will proceed in Beijing as scheduled. So particularly in light of the mess that the Tokyo 2020 Olympics has become for the IOC and its inept handling of the situation, it's hard to imagine a scenario in which the IOC would move the Beijing 2022 games or otherwise delay them. It's not in the IOC's interest, nor is it in Thomas Bach's interest, and obviously not in the CCP or Xi Jinping's interest. The IOC, as Teng Biao just eloquently and sadly described, have shown time and time again that they care little about human rights. Even now, regarding the Tokyo Games that are due to start at the end of July, we see that they are not interested in the Japanese public's concerns, nor the views of a prominent Tokyo Medical Association or others calling for the Tokyo Games not to proceed this summer because of the health crisis. I imagine the IOC is relieved to think about China, like what's next. So China is up. They don't have to worry about pesky protesters. They don't have to worry about opinion polls. They don't have to worry about independent media in China. And so Xi Jinping and Thomas Bach, they have quite a close relationship. They, I'm sure, are glad they feel confident, I'm sure, that nothing is going to rain on their mutual win-win parade. In my article, I argue for a diplomatic boycott, although I certainly understand and appreciate the arguments for a full boycott. But I think just, the obvious point of just not wanting the athletes to be unfairly penalized because of the IOC's granting these games to China and because of sort of the Chinese government's conduct, right? So we shouldn't penalize the athletes for that, and the IOC has put them in a very difficult position. That's for sure, as Sophie mentioned, and as I'm sure we'll hear from Minky, who will probably also address that point. So simply by being there, by virtue of their presence, diplomats and government officials who attend Xi Jinping's Olympics will be according legitimacy to a totalitarian regime that is engaged in a scorched earth strategy to neutralize anyone or anything that might be perceived by the CCP leadership as posing a threat to its one-party rule or to Xi's status as the preeminent leader. Again, following on what Teng Biao was arguing, just right, that it is complicity, right? That's what we will be engaged in. We, meaning diplomats and government officials, if we attend and kind of show up for these games. Attendance at Xi's games would also be a searing affront to the victims and their families of the CCP's human rights abuses, including my co-panelist, Dolkan Issa. Government representatives and possible non-official envoys should also stay home. Moreover, governments, not to mention corporate sponsors and other businesses that participate in Xi's Olympics, will be complicit in bolstering a genocidal regime that is actively promoting and exporting its repressive human rights agenda and views. In short, Xi's games will amount to a global referendum on the CCP's model of authoritarian capitalism and rights-free state-led development. The US and its allies and partners should declare a joint diplomatic boycott of the games and send a clear message in opposition, both to Beijing's human rights policies and practices and to Xi's building of a community of shared future for humankind, which is already teed up as being a central narrative for the Beijing Games. Furthermore, if diplomats and government officials from the democracies attend the games, they will become part of Xi's Olympic propaganda spectacle, which of course will be a most excellent China story in which the CCP will hold uncontestable discourse power. Against the backdrop of the Lunar New Year, which coincides with Beijing 2022, CCP propagandists will dazzle the global audience with its pro-CCP version of Chinese culture and tradition, further driving home the claim that quote unquote Chinese wisdom and a Chinese solution are the way forward to a happy, prosperous, pandemic-free world. Displays of nationalism will play a big role, and although true for all Olympic hosts, a particularly triumphalist nationalism on steroids should be expected during Beijing 2022. She pronounced a few years ago that Beijing 2022 would be a remarkable, extraordinary, and excellent event. And so it shall be. The opening ceremony will inevitably include smiling Uyghurs, Tibetans, Mongols, and others skating and dancing together, grateful to be part of the glorious Chinese cultural tradition and indebted to Xi and the CCP for their wise development policies and promotion of ethnic fusion. Given the increasing intensity of the CCP's propaganda and disinformation campaign about the Uyghurs and Xinjiang, it's easy to imagine a flood of visual stories and clips depicting the real Xinjiang and free from Western bias, and images depicting Xinjiang and Tibet as winter sports paradises. We're already seeing some of that in some of the things that Xinhua has been producing about the games. The CCP's crackdown on Western and other independent journalists in China, as my colleagues have already noted, also raises a question of who, if anyone, on the ground in February 2022 will be able to safely report a story that diverges from CCP-approved storylines. While the IOC and Thomas Bach and the CCP frequently and hypocritically claim that the game should not be politicized, and the IOC persists in rhetorically clinging to the Olympic Charter's principle of political neutrality, the modern Olympic Games have always been political, and we are seeing that political show right now at the moment with respect to what's happening with the Tokyo Games. And as Tongbia, I agree completely with Tongbia's point that these games will be very much like Hitler's 1936 Olympics. These will be Xi's version of that. Okay, I realize that I am basically out of time. Let me jump forward a bit. One second. Yeah, I just maybe we'll make one or two more points, if I may. So Beijing 2022 will be less about celebrating amazing athletes and their achievements, and much more about celebrating Xi Jinping, the party-spun history, and the policies that led to astonishing things that the world will definitely see come next February. It's going to be a big show. And some things have already been sort of advertised and promoted, including the first ever smart high-speed railway featuring a driverless bullet train that connects the two co-host cities, Beijing and Zhangjiakou, and also the rollout of the digital currency that will very likely be ready for foreign athletes and visitors to use during the Winter Games. And one other point that I wanted to make too is that Xi is all about, actually, he's a huge sports fan, and he views it as a very important part of sort of the national rejuvenation program, if you will, and also the Chinese dream. He has personally pledged that he wants to see 300 million Chinese people engaged in winter sports before February 2022. Thomas Bach, who is very much Xi Jinping's right-hand guy in terms of propaganda and promotion, is confident that goal will be reached, and he's also already said that he thinks that China's already on its way to meeting that goal. So I think the Olympics actually the Winter Olympics are going to be less about, I think, China's gold medal haul, and much more about the things like getting hundreds of millions of people involved in sports. I mean, that's a great thing, right? And also the fact that Beijing is the first city ever to host a summer Olympic Games and a Winter Olympic Games. So these things will be kind of front and center, and it will be all about Xi Jinping and the fact that he made it all happen. All right, I will stop there, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for all of that reflection, and also for the phrase rights-free state-led development, which I think and perfectly encapsulates what will be accomplished by endorsing the games, that we're endorsing a system of a Chinese system. Now, we next are going to turn to Minky Warden, who is Director of Global Initiatives at Human Rights Watch. She previously served as Human Rights Watch Media Director, and before joining HRW in 1998, Minky lived and worked in Hong Kong as advisor to Democratic Party Chairman Martin Lee, and worked at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. as a speechwriter for the U.S. Attorney General and the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys, which really, puts Minky in a very interesting place if you think about democracy and the United States and Hong Kong. And we could engage with her, I'm sure, on all kinds of things that don't directly relate to the Olympics, but she's also a wonderful person for us to hear from now about the Olympics. She's edited several important volumes on human rights, most significantly for our conversation today, the 2008 book, China's Great Leap, the Beijing Games and Olympian Human Rights. And she is a leading expert on global sports and human rights, so is perfectly positioned to speak to the International Olympic Committee and the mythology of a separation between sports and politics. Minky.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and a big thank you to our previous speakers. I want to especially thank Tung Biao because I think more than any of us, he can speak to the direct question of, do the Olympics or do major sporting events actually improve human rights? And that's one of the questions that has been on the table ever since China bid for the first time for the Olympics in China in 1993. Some of you may remember this. I remember being in Shanghai and seeing signs all over the city that said, "A more open China awaits the 2000 Olympics." And some of you will also remember that China lost the bid to host those Olympics. And it was, I really appreciated Andrea's explanation about Xi Jinping and his ambitions, his Olympic ambitions. Of course, it was Deng Xiaoping's Olympic ambitions that led to the original bidding for the Olympics back in 1993. And since I'm batting cleanup, what I'd like to do is to both look back at what happened in 2008 and what lessons can be learned from that for the world. And I'd like to look forward. And as Dr. Sophie Richardson did before me, look at what has changed and particularly identify points of leverage. But I do want to especially salute Tung Biao, who I know has also met with the International Olympic Committee and has heard directly from them, as Human Rights Watch has for many years, that the Olympics are always a force for good. And I think in the current context, we really have to question that. Many of you will remember that China made a number of promises to win the right to host the Olympics in 2008, and the Chinese government specifically said that it would improve human rights. I think our first position going into this should be that because China did not uphold human rights in the context of the 2008 Olympics, we cannot expect that it will uphold human rights in the context of the 2022 Olympics. I think we also should look at how much the situation has changed on the ground in China since 2015. At the time that China was bidding against Kazakhstan for the right to host the 2022 Winter Olympics, the Strike Hard campaign had only just begun in Xinjiang. And since then, Xi Jinping has rolled out a number of repressive policies across many areas that actually do affect the Olympics and affect the ability to hold them without causing serious human rights abuses. One point I would like to make is the Olympics themselves are sought after by repressive regimes. And I think we could look, the Olympics and frankly, all major sporting events are increasingly sought out by regimes like Russia hosted the Winter Olympics in 2014. Of course, China hosted the Olympics in 2008, the Summer Games. Qatar will host the World Cup in 2022. And Saudi Arabia has bid to host the World Cup. China also has ambitions to host the World Cup in 2032. So what is it that these governments get from hosting an event like the Olympics? For autocracies like China, the Winter Olympics or any of these events are geopolitical events, and they're intended to boost the stature of the party at home and abroad. And it gives, beyond the medal count, it gives Chinese leaders the opportunity to rub elbows with world leaders, to invite tourists and business leaders to China, to hold an opening ceremony that will be an enormous propaganda exercise, and generally to whitewash, or as we call it, sports wash, the terrible human rights abuses that Sophie Richardson has described. So I think that's the landscape here is that China, like many governments, is trying to use the Olympics to sports wash human rights abuses. I think we also have to be wary that the Olympics themselves could be a major source of human rights abuse. Normally, civil society leaders, journalists, and others like Tang Biao would experience repression during these events. So it's really the opposite of the Olympics being a force for good. I'd like to say a few words about what leverage exists to get some human rights improvements in China in the context of the Olympics. I think it's what has changed since the 2008 Olympics. One very significant thing is media and social media has significantly developed, and it is not all contained by the Great Firewall. I think that's a very important element. So the criticisms that everyone in this panel is publishing should in principle be able to be read around the world and also by people inside China. Another area that has changed very fundamentally is the passage in 2011 of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This is a very significant development because the author of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, John Ruggie, has written in a paper for FIFA that enterprises like sports are definitely covered by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And that is important because that means that the IOC is also covered. The IOC has, in fact, published a paper last December, which is called A Human Rights Strategy for the organization. However, it has not adopted it. And I think it is actually a poor decision not to adopt a human rights strategy, not to do basic human rights due diligence as Human Rights Watch and many other groups have called for, because that would be transparency and would give you leverage to demand things you're going to need very badly, like press freedom. The UN Guiding Principles, I'm going to dig down into that a little bit because that is also relevant to the sponsors. So the sponsors of the Olympics include major multinational companies that are household names around the world. It's Visa, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, Intel, and many others. So these are companies that pay many millions of dollars in exchange for being able to exclusively use the 5 rings. But I think we're seeing that with the Beijing Olympics coming up, the exclusive use of the 5 rings is going to make your company synonymous with crimes against humanity. And so the question now comes back to the companies, what are you doing? What is your human rights due diligence in China? What are your supply chains free of forced labor? So I think the spotlight of the Olympics, or you could even say the spotlight of the Olympic flame, is going to illuminate a lot of scrutiny on the International Olympic Committee, on China itself, and particularly on corporate sponsors. I also wanted to talk very specifically about a single area, which is press freedom. Press freedom is required under the Olympic Charter in black and white. It's also in the host city contract that the IOC signed with Beijing, and it's very specifically enumerated as a requirement for hosting the Olympics. And then finally, in 2016, before the Rio Olympics, the International Olympic Committee set up a so-called press freedom mechanism so that journalists who are experiencing press freedom abuses can complain to the IOC and get what we call remedy, which is relief. So if you're arrested and beaten up by the police in the context of doing your reporting in China, you ought to be able to report that directly to the IOC and to get relief and an apology and to be able to continue your reporting. So one other thing I should mention is that the IOC, press freedom is important to the IOC because 73% of the organization's revenues come from the sale of media rights. So press freedom is really an existential concern for the IOC, or it certainly should be. I'm aware that a number of press freedom organizations have written to the IOC already expressing very serious concerns about the reporting environment in China and that the Chinese government is already in breach of the Olympic Charter's requirements on press freedom. I think a final area that I might pick up on that I think both Sophie Richardson and Dre mentioned, and that is the role of athletes. And athletes have always been pioneers and leaders in human rights, in civil rights. Some of the most iconic moments in sport relate to advocacy of human rights. We saw the not just Colin Kaepernick taking a knee for racial justice in America and around the world, but of course at the Sochi Olympics, a number of LGBT athletes took enormous personal and professional risks to advocate for LGBT rights. We have seen Daryl Morley's tweet causing a literal firestorm within the NBA, a coach who tweeted in support of democracy in Hong Kong. And so it is not possible, as the IOC has long said, to separate politics and sport. In fact, the two are so closely entwined that it is an opportunity on the horizon, but not one without risks for athletes. And more to the point, the IOC, which claims to represent all athletes worldwide, should not be sending global athletes into an environment where they will not have free speech, where they will not have freedom of association, and where they will not be able to voice their support for causes like ending the abuses of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, freedom for Hong Kong, or religious freedom and autonomy in Tibet. So with that, I'm really looking forward to any tough questions and also a lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to remind everyone in the audience to send the questions in. And I'm going to start with a question that maybe is for you, Minky. And it's a question that I've been thinking about. I don't know whether it's coming from my position as a parent or where it's precisely it's coming from. But there are two kinds of people that I wonder how you would advise in this moment. And the first is an athlete. Would you go? Would you boycott? Does it depend if you're an athlete who's got a string of gold medals already, or you're going to win? You're going to win in a world in a different World Cup type event, or if this is your one shot at the Olympics kind of thing. So how would you advise an athlete facing this moment? And then the other set of people I'd like advice for, and this could be, and any one of you could weigh in on this. How would you advise a journalist? Because it strikes me that this moment of press access might allow some of the journalists who have not been able to go to China to get back in.
Yeah. And let me actually answer the second question first, because I want to clarify something that a question I've gotten from a lot of journalists. So the question is, oh, press freedom is just for the duration of the Olympics and Paralympics. And I want to say that's wrong. Starting right now, press freedom related to Olympic topics is totally guaranteed. So let's just say hypothetically, if a Wall Street Journal reporter or any reporter is investigating, for example, the whether forced labor in Xinjiang is being used to create Olympic uniforms with the five rings. That story is a protected story because that's a journalist working on a human rights abuse that is tied to the Olympics. So starting right now, not 9 months from now, press freedom is guaranteed in China around the Olympics. So I would advise all journalists to get your applications into your relevant national Olympic committees. You should also write to the IOC and demand your right to be there and cover these Olympics. It is a sacrosanct right, and it is in, as I said, it's in the Olympic Charter, it's in the press freedom mechanism, and it is in the host city contract, which is a public document. I encourage everyone to look it up. On the question about athletes, I want, there are many amazing organizations working in the world on athlete rights, and I'm going to mention a few of them by name. And there's a group called World Players, which is the global athletes player. It's a trade union for professional players. It includes groups like FIFPro, which is all of the football players, or the NBA Players Association, or the WNBA Players Association. So these are groups that are used to advocating for athlete rights. There are also other groups like Global Athlete. And I know that these groups include Olympians and many others, and some of them who actually tried to speak out at the 2008 Olympics and were shut down. So I think there are a number of athletes have organized to protect themselves so that one athlete doesn't have to speak out and face professional destruction. So I think it's very appropriate that these athlete groups would find out what the risks are and help athletes address them. I also think national Olympic committees have a real responsibility. We haven't spoken about them yet, but they have a real responsibility to address the risks, right? So sport is all about assessing risks. And the last thing I would say is that since Human Rights Watch works a lot on sexual abuse and other abuses of athletes in sport, and increasingly you have seen gymnasts and others speaking out about abuse and demanding their rights. And I would be very surprised if they are not already considering what they can say. And in any event, Twitter wasn't meaningfully around, for example, for the 2008 Olympics. A single tweet by an athlete or a national delegation or a coach or a fan could result in some type of thermonuclear incident. So I think these are the very questions that the IOC and all national delegations should be asking.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pull a question from the discussion board. This is from Paul Sullivan, who is an MA candidate at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School and an intern in the East-West Center. And this is, I think, a good one for Tung Biao to handle. But again, if anybody else wants to weigh in, please do. He asks, given the PRC's history of utilizing whataboutist rhetoric in the face of allegations about human rights abuses from the United States and others, what are your thoughts on diffusing this strategy if leveraged against a boycott campaign?
Oh, thank you very much. I was refuting the political whataboutism on BBC a few weeks ago. That's a bad strategy to silence the critics. So they don't want to talk about the human rights violations in China. They don't want to talk about the Olympic Charter or anything else related to Beijing Winter Olympics, but to to challenge the legitimacy of the question. So, of course, the United States or any other democratic countries are not perfect. They have social and political and human rights problems, but that kind of problem is definitely not comparable to the genocide, like detaining at least a million people into the concentration camps, and other like the 150 Tibetans self-immolated, or the atrocities in Mongolia, Hong Kong, Tibet. So that's a very different, and by the way, some people also argue that to boycott Olympics can go nowhere, like the case of boycotting Moscow Olympics, but that two different cases too, and now the geopolitical situation has been very different from 1980. Yeah.
I have. Does anyone else want to say anything about the whataboutism argument, Sophie?
I just would add that as that's become a more frequent line of argumentation from Chinese diplomats, I think other diplomats have gotten better at responding to it. And even if you just look at the Twitter feeds, not just of European parliamentarians, meaning members of the European Parliament, but also members of parliaments of member states, in response to the Chinese foreign minister's comment yesterday that Europe knows a thing or two about genocide, which is sort of the diplomatic equivalent of, kind of schoolyard takes one to know one, you did it too, and therefore it's okay. I'm astonished looking at some of the German MPs across the different parties who were responding and saying, yes, it's true, that happened, and here are the ways that we have sought to, remedy that. Here are the museums, here are the court cases, here's the restitution. I mean, I don't mean to suggest that any of that is perfect, but I think many diplomats are now very well prepared for that. And, one of Human Rights Watch's responses is to make sure that a decent amount of the work that we do on, for example, human rights violations in the United States is translated into Chinese. And on the rare occasions we meet with Chinese diplomats and they will say, well, what about all of the US's problems? We will push a stack of these documents across the table and say, can we go back to talking about you? Because that's what we're here to discuss. So I think I think it also helps catalyze thinking about what kinds of human rights violations and remedies should be pursued in other countries. Anyway, just a thought.
Absolutely. Minky.
I just wanted to tack on to that there's another kind of whataboutism that's practiced by global sports bodies, sports governing bodies. And that is to say, well, every country has human rights abuses. And so we have to go where the human rights abuses are happening. And I just wanted to say that with, Human Rights Watch's report this spring about crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, with the ongoing heartbreaking documentation of the very human toll on families in Xinjiang of separation, torture, abuse, sexual violence, and other crimes, that China is in now the very small number of countries that are actually committing crimes against humanity. And so this is not, Human Rights Watch reports on more than 100 countries worldwide. We did a report in 1996 on the prison system in the state of Georgia in the run-up to the Atlanta Olympics. We're not giving anyone a pass, but China is the first country that is actively committing crimes against humanity while hosting. And that is the big problem for the IOC, for sponsors, for NBC, and for National Olympic Committees, is that these games are very different because it's being used to cover up and to justify crimes against humanity.
Dolken, could I ask you to speak a bit to the situation in Europe and your successes in the face of all of this with getting audiences and getting European governing bodies to hear you, or failures or frustrations, and then maybe a little bit also as an overseas Uyghur to say a bit more about just the importance of this in the face of the atrocities that are going on in Xinjiang?
Well, European and the European government we have seen some in the past. Just U.S. government and first the country take concrete action to reaction for the genocide or crime against humanity. Rest of some European country reaction very slow. We have seen, but however, no, little bit wake up. And we have seen European Union plus United States, Canada, and UK sanction for high-level Chinese government official. This is a good step, but problem is still so many Western companies, particularly German company, continue to make business with China. So, for example, Adidas and the sponsor for the Olympic, we have approaching so many Western companies who's sponsor for the Olympic Committee, Olympic Games, and some other, for example, Volkswagen. Even this year, German insurance company Allianz. First, I heard this year is a sponsor for the Olympics. In the past, no, but this year, this is big surprisingly. So no, it is yes, in the governmental level and some parliament really and involving this issue, but this reaction, I believe, is very slow. We had also approaching several national Olympic committee. For example, we had a meeting, the German National Committee, to convince to them. We have at least twice meeting with them, virtual meeting. Well, most of them Olympic Committee, same national committee, same line to the International Olympic Committee. So, well, we are not involved in politics. Actually, it's not political issue. It is, well, it is all the time Olympic Committee and hiding behind of the political neutralism. It is not because. Yeah, sometimes saying is that, oh, China has promised protects human rights, respects human rights. There is a very good example. 2008 Beijing Olympics, and also China promised a lot, but is the Tibetan people's peaceful demonstration cracked down. After 1 year later, 5th July 2009, Uyghur peaceful demonstration was cracked down. But no situation is getting from bad to worse. And yeah, sometimes say, oh, human rights violation and happening and everywhere. Yes, different of level happening everywhere. But what's going on? And for the Uyghur people today, it is not human rights violation, simple. It is beyond also human rights violation. It is already genocide and crime against humanity. So some countries still is hesitant. There is some countries, particularly European countries, democratic countries, and then have a moral and legal obligation to stop the genocide. One side saying, well, there is a huge human rights violation or genocide and or crime against humanity, but other side is a company continue to make business, no measure to stop this and make business with China because it's not correct kind business as usual, and other side continue business. It is not a way to stop this. So that's why we are saying not only government's obligations. There is we have to this transatlantic cooperation is important. I think transatlantic, United States and European Union. I don't believe in the Muslim country really in the stand with the Western country stops this genocide, because we have witnessed so many Muslim countries support China's genocidal policy towards the Uyghur. Unfortunately, we have UN level, UN level. So that at least and the United States and Europe and some other democratic nation should be corporate transatlantic cooperation. And also NGOs campaign, athletes, and the companies should be multi-cooperation, and it's the only way, I think, more effective. Other way, just some countries or some Olympic committees stand alone is not playing much a role for stop this. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I have a question that I think may be slightly unfair, because it's asking some of our panelists to question Andrea's position on the diplomatic boycott and whether or not it should be more than a diplomatic boycott, or whether more than a diplomatic boycott is feasible. So I have another question in the queue in my mind for Andrea, but I'm going to use you to launch my question to everybody else, which is, you make a very good case for the logic that only a diplomatic boycott is feasible because the IOC is going to do this come hell or high water, and there's too much economics involved and all that. But is there my question has two parts. Is there any possibility of something broader? And if there is, is there any reason to think that the timing of something broader should be closer to the date of the Olympics? And I'm thinking, just if I were in government, I might be thinking, well, if I'm going to boycott this thing, I'm not going to announce it and then give the PRC, 9 months to respond. I'm going to boycott closer to the date. So that could be the timing of a diplomatic boycott or the timing of something more forceful. But any responses to the diplomatic versus other kinds of boycott?
It's an excellent question. Sophie, were you going to jump in?
Well, I'm going to jump in partly to say, Minky and I may be the wrong people to ask because we agree with Andrea on this about a diplomatic boycott. But I think, Johanna, the reason it may take a while until we hear about that is partly the logic that you sketch out, that there may be an effort to coordinate amongst certain governments. They want to hold out the possibility of their doing that as a form of leverage, up until the last minute. But I'm not exactly sure what you mean by more broadly, meaning a broader boycott, like a full-on boycott. I think there have been, lots.
I'm wondering whether, the full-on boycott, would it be, I could imagine individual countries with maybe less at stake in China saying, we're going to take a stand on this. Not necessarily, I don't see the US taking a stand on this.
Yeah,
but I'm wondering whether the diplomatic boycott is enough. It would be huge if the US did an actual diplomatic boycott. Certainly, as I said, I could envision there'd be a lot of behind the scenes conversation before such a thing would be announced, and now will probably not be when you would announce it. But then in the meantime, you have atrocities ongoing. And time if your 3-year-old is off in a detention camp or in an orphanage away from parents who were detained, that's a quarter of their life between now and the Olympics. So
I also
Minky and
just before Minky goes, that I have heard from several governments that they are waiting anxiously to see what happens with the Tokyo Games, because they seem increasingly to be of the view that if the Tokyo Games wind up being canceled or postponed for public health reasons, it creates more room to go back to the IOC and say, shouldn't you cancel or move games that are being held China because of appalling human rights violations. So I think that's another variable. But if we're talking about the efficacy of boycotts, I'll pass the baton, so to speak, maybe to Minky and then to Dolken.
I wanted to make a couple of points that are related to the general theme of boycotts. And the first one is that the Chinese government has threatened that it will thuggishly punish in unspecified but clearly terrible ways any government that attempts to boycott. Now, that is completely at odds with the so-called Olympic movement and the Olympic spirit, because it can't possibly be the case that countries are forced to go to the Olympics, and if you don't, you'll be punished. So first of all, China's put now essentially you are forced to go to the Olympics and you have no choice. So that's the first point I wanted to make, which is completely in violation of the Olympic spirit, or anybody's idea of the Olympic spirit.
You might have 300 million people being forced to do winter sports too.
Yeah. Well, I will say that's what I thought when I read that quote, frankly. One of the harder things is that it's very difficult to investigate abuses of athletes in China, although we certainly have reports by a number of brave athletes, and there are reasons for concern about that. But just to return to the boycott is like, it's like anything else. It's a tool, right? And so it depends on how you use it. And I think while Human Rights Watch doesn't back the comprehensive boycott without, where you keep your athletes at home, we certainly would do back the diplomatic boycott. But the bigger question is, a boycott shouldn't be a substitute for policies. And the way we all got here with China bullying the entire world abroad and repressing its own people in increasingly severe ways, is that there isn't a coherent strategy around China in the world to address crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, forced labor in supply chains, the harsh and unbelievable crackdown in Hong Kong that violates an international treaty, the Joint Declaration, and religious freedom abuses in Tibet and beyond. So the boycott should not be a substitute for a policy that addresses these very serious human rights abuses. I do believe the Olympics can sharpen the discussion. And I fully expect that U.S. Congress and members of parliaments around the world should be preparing their questions for sports bodies about their policies in China, but that there's also a need for that broader political initiative to address these very serious crimes against humanity.
I suppose another area in which boycott type activities could take place or would be in the way the media represents the games, right? So you could have not we won't be there, but we won't go and cover it the way you want it covered, which would be not the state doing it, but then the media would be jeopardizing its own access, I suppose.
Let me just say, I have every confidence that, for example, the BBC, which has the media rights to the Olympics, both for Japan and also for China, I have every confidence that the BBC wants to do a very thorough job of interrogating every dimension of the Olympics and covering not just sports, but also the political situation. However, the BBC bureau chief, John Sutcliffe, is no longer in the country. So I think it's a legitimate complaint that news organizations would have right now that they're not able to cover the Olympics, including media rights holders. How are you able to cover the Olympics without your bureau chief is a very reasonable question.
Tongbiao, do you want to say anything about this, or?
Yeah, briefly, I think it will be very great if any countries can boycott diplomatically boycott that refusing to send any officials to attend the opening ceremony or closing ceremony. That would be great, and I think it's not likely for many countries and many athletes boycotting Beijing Winter Olympics. But I think, yes, suppose Belarus is going to host the Winter Olympics in 9 months. And I think it's very likely that it will be boycotted. So in other words, people don't want to boycott, not because other reasons, but because they are afraid of Chinese economic and political retaliation and bullying. I think that's the main reason. Yeah.
We have a question from one of our audience members, and audience, please do feel free to keep questions coming in. This is a question that I think I'm going to direct first to Andrea, although Tongbiao, I know you've also been on panels where you've talked about the academic environment with regard to China. And so you can look at the question in the queue, but this is from a performance studies scholar who has an activist background, but is also in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, is well aware of human rights issues across Asia, but wants advice for arts scholars who do active research in China, remembering that artists in China are also vulnerable to various forces. I would say, as I'm going to expand this to include academic researchers who have to move between the space of wanting access to the country and wanting to preserve networks and be connected to people in the PRC, and yet knowing that this is a difficult time. So this goes a bit beyond the Olympics, but maybe Andrea, you could reflect on the scholar/artist position.
Thank you for the question. Right, I think that for these issues, really any human rights issues with respect to China, it's really important to just to speak out, to write, if for artists to paint, to draw, to dance, and sort of maybe honor, for example, with respect to folks in Xinjiang. We know that so many, musicians and artists and dancers are have died, have been killed, or are currently in the concentration camps. To sort of, honor them, acknowledge them, maybe dedicate a dance to them or something, right? Just to raise awareness and to sort of honor them. Another thought, is that, let me just actually look at the question one more time. Yes, is to maybe think about and perhaps write about the role of opening ceremonies in the Olympics, right? So we saw, the 2008 opening ceremony, right, just sort of like, wow, blew everybody away, right? So what can we expect for 2022, right? Knowing the political points that the CCP wants to make with that, with the opening ceremony, which is very much, again, as I and others have pointed out, it invariably will involve Uyghurs and Tibetans and Mongols, with smiling faces, dancing, perhaps, dancing on ice skating, whatever, just to, praising Xi Jinping and the sort of ethnic fusion policies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I wonder if there's something just like creative that could be done around that, sort of, or to say, this is what we would like to see, or what we would expect from an opening ceremony of a free country that has this incredible, wealth of diversity in it, right? So to honor the various members of minority communities and their traditions. I'll stop there. Just that was sort of on the fly. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think many people know the cases of two Michaels, the two Canadian citizens detained in China, and Australian journalist, a Chinese Australian journalist was detained, and other cases like American journalists were expelled. But one suggestion I may give is don't self-censor too much. So it's kind of understandable to have kind of a censorship to protect your own safety and maybe your partner's security. But it's common that too many people, that scholars and artists and journalists practice too much self-censorship. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that point. But thank you. It's a great question. I'd love to keep in touch about that. If I may, I would love.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Sorry, I'd love to follow up on points that both Minky and Sophie have made and have alluded to, sort of problems. Well, so the great thing about athlete activism just taking off, right? But also the risks that athletes will face in China, right? So these are serious risks that they face. So today I just took a quick look at the State Department travel advisory for China. It is level 3. That's the second highest warning level, which is reconsider travel to the People's Republic of China due to arbitrary enforcement of local laws. Japan, just FYI, is now at level 4, which is do not travel. But so are we prepared? I mean, athletes will protest, and they have the right to protest. They have the right to speak out. And are we, meaning sort of our governments and the democracies, are we ready for that? Are we ready to protect them and to sort of intervene on their behalf on the ground in China? I think it's important that be obviously discussed and kind of mapped out in advance. Right. So what happens when athletes run into trouble? There'll be protests, right? And there should be, or people wearing various political T-shirts, right? So there's that, like, preparedness for what we know will eventually happen, and also that we should encourage athletes in terms of voicing their opinions and exercising their freedom of expression, right? But also, I think that it's important for governments to work with the National Olympic Committees with respect to alerting athletes to how they might unwittingly be used, right? In CCP propaganda. I mean, so much of it sounds so good, right? How can you be against, like, a community of shared future for humankind, right? So my concern there would be some, like, cool snowboarder kind of be like, oh yeah, that sounds awesome, right? So like a CGTN or Xinhua reporter who's like now young and cool and hip, getting commentary from various athletes about, right, the Xi's dream and Xi's vision and community of shared future and the Belt and Road Initiative, which is also part of this. I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. Also, there's going to be a lot of I think a lot of propaganda around how green. So we've talked. Menke mentioned sports washing, right, which is happening now, but also greenwashing. So these are going to be apparently, already phenomenally green and sustainable games. So China has invested a lot of money in the technology to make the games, really, like, sort of, sustainable and just very impressive. And so there's already a lot of chatter on, just the CGTN and Xinhua, and also, again, Thomas Bach and the IOC saying, oh, these are like going to be the most sustainable and greenest games ever. So there's that whole element of greenwashing going on that I think also needs to be explored and flagged too. And maybe the journalists can get on that.
I'll just respond on the Olympics, on the athletes point. And I think it's really a legitimate one, because the question is which athletes would want to win a medal at the Crimes Against Humanity Olympics or the Genocide Olympics, right? And I think it really does put athletes in an invidious position. I think Sophie mentioned it earlier, but Olympic gold medalist and skier Michaela Schifrin she framed it very clearly as being forced to choose between her job and her morals. And I want to also put I think it's important for us to remember that athletes are workers, right? This is their workplace. So why is the IOC making them go into a hazardous workplace where the Wi-Fi sniffers at the border will download the contents of their phone, where they could be under surveillance? And I want to say a few words here about health. You mentioned the environment, but sport is supposed to be, in addition to being about rules, it's also supposed to be about health. And I think it's a good moment to recall that in the run-up to the Beijing Olympics in 2008, the Chinese government quashed information that the nation's milk supply was contaminated by melamine, which resulted in some 300,000 Chinese babies being poisoned. And I believe 6 deaths from that. So this is information that was hidden from the world until after the Olympics and the Paralympics in 2008. And I think and to me, that's a precursor of hiding information about the pandemic, and not giving people an opportunity to prepare and protect themselves. So access to information and freedom of information isn't just important to literally cover the games. It's actually important for the health and well-being of athletes, coaches, fans, and others who would travel to China. This is not a government you can trust to tell you what you need to know about the health environment of the Olympics.
We have a question in the queue that asks about what the IOC knows. And I think, it's given that Tang Biao has come knocking at their door and tried to talk to them, and Human Rights Watch has reached out to them, we know that they have all the information they should have. But I'm going to develop that question and ask a little bit about IOC capacity, because it would seem to me, again, as someone who's not on the IOC and is not is not a head of state, I know just a history professor, but it would seem to me that the IOC is making claims about what it can do for journalists and athletes that it can, if they're in China, that it cannot possibly uphold in terms of protecting them. That the IOC has if freedom of the press is really something that's supposed to be part of what the IOC does, then a journalist who travels to the PRC and then finds themselves in a difficult situation should be able to turn around and say, wait a sec, you didn't help me, IOC. Yeah. Same thing for an athlete. So what are their lawyers thinking?
Well, let me actually take a step back. And I'd like to ask I'd actually like to ask an important question to this panel. How many IOC staff are on the ground in China now, with the Olympics a mere 9 months away? I believe the answer is 0. And it's because the model of the Olympics is that you partner with the host city or government in this case. And that means that, so for example, ahead of the Sochi Olympics, we found out that the IOC was only seeing in its news clips information that was sent to it by the Russian government, right? So they're really not in a position to even know or assess what is happening on the ground in China. That's a big problem in relation to due diligence. They don't have their own independent sources of information. For example, about forced labor and supply chains. And so I think the assumption is that the IOC must have its own large operation there or on the ground in Japan, and that's simply not true. It's a local partner model. But that doesn't absolve you of the responsibility to protect athletes and journalists and others, because your partner is the problem. And that is frankly what we've seen in other countries around the world, is that the source of the human rights abuse is actually your Olympic partner. And the IOC does not have systems in place to deal with that. I think most people will remember when 25,000 journalists arrived in China in August of 2008, the Great Firewall was up and journalists weren't able to work because there was no access to the internet. So that was a knowable thing. The IOC did not take the steps that it should have taken when warned extensively in advance that this was going to be a problem. So I think that now is the time for the IOC to start dealing with the entirely predictable problems that will arise out of the colossal human rights abuses, as previously detailed by Dr. Sophie Richardson. Thank you.
Dr. Sophie Richardson.
Which is that, just to be clear, even if the IOC has zero boots on the ground, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that Juan Antonio Samaranch has a subscription to the New York Times or could get one. These people have absolutely no excuse for not knowing. And even if they don't have a subscription to a proper newspaper, the number of advocates who have gone to them again and again and again and again, us, the World Uyghur Congress, other friends from the human rights movement. And it really is kind of the functional equivalent of talking to a small child who just puts her hands over her ears and doesn't want to hear it. Or, our last conversation with them ended with my saying, we seem to be stuck on 3-word phrases, and yours is force for good and mine is crimes against humanity. And they don't want to know. They don't want to know because they aren't going to do anything about it. And if anything, they're trying to figure out how to duck responsibility or pretend like they don't know. But that's just ridiculous.
My colleague at the University of Chicago has a question in our queue that brings up crimes against humanity and the IOC history. So John McClune asks, would it not be helpful to remind the IOC of the exception it made to its sports/politics separation rhetoric in the case of South African apartheid, on the grounds that this was not politics, but, quote, a crime against humanity? The IOC remains proud of this history. Should it not be repeatedly asked how genocide is not a crime against humanity?
Can I say something for this? Yeah, we did already, and now is a huge number NGOs, coalition, and Tibet, Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Taiwanese organization. I joined more than 180 organizations jointly send a letter, and we also remind them, and the Olympic Committee should not be ignored the ongoing genocide. But so far, we know, and World Youth Congress and Tibet organization, and the Tingbya also was joining us, if I'm not wrong. So, but Olympic Committee is all the time, so we are not involved in, we are write letters several times. World Youth Congress, I personally write letter to, and also we, and the complaint for the Ethics Committee as well. We write letter to the former Secretary General of United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, now is the commissioner for the Ethics Committee. We write letter, but this is all same answer, very simple. Why we are already talked to the Chinese government, very respects of human rights. Chinese government promised to respect human rights, and the Olympic Committee is not involved in the politics. Just we have a neutral position. This is the answer. We are continually reminding for the ongoing genocide and the crime against humanity. But Olympic Committee, as I understand, is a very corrupted organization, just mostly the thinking of the money. This is the situation. Maybe, now we are going to start campaign, no Beijing 22 global campaign, 23 of June this year. And in Olympic days, International Olympic Day, 23 of June. So now we are calling this day organize a huge demonstration in front of the Olympic Committee in Europe, in the Lausanne. And now we are preparing for this. And also not only, now we are what Congress, we are preparing because of the restrictions of pandemic, how many people can come in to the Lausanne, we don't know. But we are calling all the people, Tibetan, Hong Kongers together, Uyghurs. And also same time, same days, we organize the demonstration in front of National Olympic Committee globally. So we are trying. We will have to try all way to stop this. But however, Olympic Committee looks and they continue taking place this Beijing Olympic, but just ignored all kind of your warning, and even we also complain lawsuit against Olympic Committee, but it's not accept or complain as well.
Yeah, Minky.
Yeah, if I could say, there are several times that the IOC has intervened very clearly in what would be seen as human rights matters. Another, in addition to banning South Africa for sending all white teams, which they should have done a lot earlier than they actually did. The IOC banned Afghanistan for excluding women from sport and also for executing people in stadiums. And the IOC intervened in South Korea when there were students in the streets to press the government to hold elections before the Olympics, this before the 1988 South Korean Summer Games. So there are, if you look in Olympic history, plenty of moments when the IOC has actually used its power on what are essentially human rights issues. And I think I know we're arriving at time, but I wanted to add that the Chinese government has put its hat in the ring to host the Olympics in 2032. And if we don't want to keep having this same discussion over and over again until 2032, we're actually the IOC sponsors, the media, athletes, and others are going to have to, governments and parliaments are going to have to start using our power and leverage to tell the Chinese government that you can't simultaneously host the Olympics while orchestrating a massive campaign of crimes against humanity.
Since we're arriving at time, that would be a good place to leave it. But I want to give people a chance to say one more thing more broadly. It does certainly seem as if it's not just the IOC that's in thrall to the PRC, but that the world community is in thrall and in fear of a lot of what has been said about what if you stand up in the face of these kinds of abuses. What can happen to individuals and to countries, So if anyone wants to offer, if you each want to offer, say, a closing minute before we wrap up for the evening, that would be wonderful. And just want to also thank everyone for participating.
They're great questions. Maybe I'll kick off. I don't know if you want us to go in the order in which we started, but maybe
that might be a good way to. Sure, that's organized.
One way to think about this would be, what if the IOC actually really cared? What would we see it do? And what if the Chinese government actually lived up to its human rights obligations as opposed to trying to thwart them? What would the world look like, and what would that mean for these kinds of games? What would we see the IOC do? What would be different inside China? And I think the reality is that we wouldn't be having this conversation. But that's not the world that we live in. And I think for those commitments to be made on paper, to be made meaningful, we need to see, first and foremost, real accountability. And I mean that in the legal sense, for serious human rights crimes and for the government officials who are responsible for those. You know, and for the IOC to, I don't have the polite words available to me right now about the IOC, but it's simply, you know, it is devoid of credibility at this point. It is simply, you know, a body that sets standards it then doesn't implement. And, you know, that sets, I think, a very negative example for other kinds of international organizations. And frankly, I think leaves athletes dangling, and it becomes, the games become a favorite plaything of authoritarians.
Yeah, I think it's a very ridiculous if IOC uses the case of South Korea to justify its decision to avoid authoritarian, totalitarian governments to host the Olympics, and China has proven that the Olympics won't bring human rights improvement or rule of law, and of course the genocide exactly deprived the IOC of the legitimacy of making that decision. And I want to remind people of very recent news that 21 marathon athletes died of the extremely terrible mismanagement. So Chinese government doesn't care about the life and rights of athletes.
Dolken?
Well, thank you. And I would like to say that all people and all countries and the politicians, civil society, athletes, media, company, and everyone should be remember, recognize, and should be. It is a moral obligation. So we just call whole human being because no, it's ongoing genocide and crime against humanity today. In this situation is the silence, and it is just the complicity of this ongoing genocide. So I would just call and ask every human being should be recognized. It is a moral obligation. Yeah.
I did. Oh, sorry, Dre. Yep.
So, right. So I'd like to just close with a kind of a heads up and a reminder. So the IOC and China are very close. We know that. And actually Thomas Bach and Xi Jinping have just a very close personal relationship and personal professional relationship. And this is something I'm going to be writing about in an upcoming article. But I wanted to flag for the community, for fellow panelists, but also, you know, for those who may be still watching, that the IOC has permanent observer status at the UN. And as Sophie just mentioned, rightly so, you know, this is a non-transparent, completely unaccountable organization, basically. But they are gathering more and more power at the UN alongside China, and with respect to sport and human rights, sport and the Olympic ideal. In the upcoming Human Rights Council session, which starts in late June, I believe. No, I'm sorry. Yeah. When does it start? Oh, okay. Anyway, so the upcoming Human Rights Council session on July 7, there will be a once in every 4 years, so quadrennial thematic discussion on promoting human rights through sport and the Olympic ideal. I think it's important for folks, you know, who are working in this space to sort of pay attention to this. I think we're going to see China make a big move at this in this thematic discussion, as well as the IOC. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, and thanks again for this great discussion.
We had a question come in about calls to action too. So Minky, as you hop in, give us a call to action. And I think Andrea's point about this, the date at the beginning of July is another part of the call to action.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I want to close with by just reiterating that this is a moment of opportunity, that there is the possibility of exerting leverage on China because of its ambitions to host these games, and the leverage is essentially this: sports is rules based. You have to abide by the rules if you want to host. There can't be some double standard where human rights rules and forced labor rules only apply to Los Angeles hosting the Summer Olympics, or Paris, or another Western country. So the chasm between what China says it's doing and what it's actually doing is very apparent. I think the research is in. And then the question is, what's the world going to do about it? And I do think that the Olympics give a pressure point. They give a pressure point because the Olympic spotlight that Xi Jinping and other leaders seek also illuminates these abuses. And it does give us points to make about press freedom, internet freedom, ending forced labor, and actually companies justifying how, for example, they can continue to operate in Xinjiang with the current forced labor and terrible crimes against humanity. So I think without the Olympics, we would and should be bringing the same pressure, but that we have 9 months for the world to develop a strategy to deal with these very serious crimes. And I really think we can't leave it to athletes to make this case. It really rests on policymakers around the world to say no double standards where China gets to break the rules and host and still rake in all the gold medals. Thank you
very much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience, our sponsors, the Posen Center for Human Rights, the History Department at the University of Chicago, and the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Chicago. I really appreciate all of you making time for this important issue, and that you can take on board everything that our panelists have shared with us this evening. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening.